Welcome, everybody, to Finance Essentials with Danny Hudson. I am your host, Danny Hudson, and I am so happy to be here with you guys this week. We've got a great show. I mean, let's be honest, they're all pretty great, but this one I'm super excited about. And believe me, don't worry. After the show, you guys are more than welcome to tell me how great they all are. I don't want anybody to think that I don't appreciate the praise. So by all means, please feel free to keep it coming. We're welcoming you here this Wednesday on a nice rainy day here in Nashville. I didn't even have to put the blinds down behind me. Well, maybe I should have put the blinds down, but that's okay. As I'm sure you guys have probably seen in the news lately, Nashville's gotten a little bit of rain, a little bit of flooding. Unfortunately, a few people have lost their lives and everything, and so hopefully we're keeping our fingers crossed that we can get a few days without some rain here. Let everything dry up a little bit. Golf course around the corner was quite flooded. I'm sure a lot of those folks out there that had those Tuesday afternoon tee times were probably a bit disappointed because I don't think their golf carts do so well going through 2-3 foot puddles. But hey, that's all right, right? It'll dry up. We'll have brighter days. We'll move on, and we'll continue to excel. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I appreciate all the support. As I have mentioned before on previous shows, I guess just the one previous show that I have decided to no longer spend any money marketing or on advertising on social media. So if we want the show to continue to grow, that is on you and that is on me. If you get value, if you enjoy the show, by all means, please feel free to share it. I know that I don't generally tend to share a lot of the shows that I listen to, but I've started to try to be better about that, mainly because I think it's very important that we share the messages that help form our thoughts, our knowledge, our beliefs, right? Because that helps make us who we are, and I think that that's important. Now, and then we allow other people to choose whether or not that they want to listen, right? We'll let them listen, challenge, and maybe sometimes too it's going to create some great discussion. For example, one of the shows I listen to, the Bob Murphy Show, shout out to Bob. I won't charge you for the plug, but he did a show a couple weeks ago with a doctor out of Oklahoma, and the hospital or the practice that they participate in is a direct primary care office, and he goes into great detail as far as insurance scams, not scams, but how insurance companies and big hospitals, they overinflate the cost of procedures because there's back-end deals and all those other types of things that seem really kind of scummy when we have a discussion on healthcare. I know a lot of you guys probably have opinions on the healthcare system. You probably have opinions on whether or not that should be controlled by government, whatever it might be. But the doctor talks about how his procedures are 1/6 to 1/10 of the cost that they are going through another one. And so that information is very valuable to me. And so I have decided I share that with people where I think that it's relevant and that kind of thing. So by all means, like I said, that's a long way to get around basically is saying share the show if you think it's good. That, and also to follow us on social media. We're on all the platforms at this point. So don't hesitate to do that. But diving into today's show, we've got a great one. Sometimes the federal government or the business world or the economic environment just happens to give us a situation where we can say, hey, this is going to be something good to look at. And our good friend Mayor Pete Buttigieg decided that he wanted to do that for us this week. If you guys may not know who Pete Buttigieg is, he is the Secretary of Transportation for the Biden administration. He is a former Democratic nominee for the presidential position. I know him being the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He has an extensive record of transportation experience. I'm sure if he was filling out a resume with his transportation experience, he would probably struggle to fit it on one page because South Bend, Indiana, I know is an area when we think of traffic and we think of transportation, that is where That's where our mind goes, right? We think about South Bend, Indiana, and we think definitely qualified to hold that position. So, so what Pete Buttigieg has done recently, I believe it was last week, essentially announced that the Biden administration is looking into passing a mileage tax. So yes, if you're tuning in, this episode is about tax, but don't turn it off yet. I swear I'll make it interesting. I promise. Well, I don't make a lot of promises, but I do promise that it'll be interesting. But Pete Buttigieg has essentially said that the Biden administration and himself are interested in passing, or at least they're discussing the opportunity or the option to pass a vehicle mileage tax. And if you are unsure what a vehicle mileage tax is, a vehicle mileage tax is essentially a way of tracking your movements in your car, in your transportation, and then they charge you a tax based off of how many miles that you drive. Now, you might be thinking, why do they care? Why do they care how I drive? Why do they care where I go to or my commute or any of those kinds of things? Well, the easy answer is they have a $3 trillion infrastructure bill that they have to pretend that they need to fund, right? So they have to basically say, well, we're going to spend $3 trillion over the next decade, so we have to pretend to come up with ways that we think can fund it. Because we know the real answer, if you've been listening and you've been tuning into the show, is that they're really just going to print the money, right? And then they'll just add it to the national debt, and then they'll inflate it by printing more money and that kind of thing. But we're not going to go into that. But what they're going to say is that we need to fund this $3 trillion infrastructure. So this option is on the table. Now, what it also means is that when they go to pass this, that they will be able to track where you go and they charge it. And part of the reason why they're considering it too is because if you're one of the fortunate people who have the ability to be able to afford a Tesla or another electric vehicle, you do not currently participate, or for the most part anyway, in the gas tax system. And so what that means is that when you go to fill up at the pump, right? If you're like me and you drive an internal combustion engine car, when you go to fill up your gas, you pay a federal gas tax, and you also pay state gas taxes. And so to give you an idea, the federal gas tax is about 18.3 cents per gallon, and it has been in place since about 1933. It's been raised about 10 times since then, up until about 1993, and then they haven't increased it since then. But one thing you may also be aware of, or maybe you're not, is that states also charge gas taxes. And so one of the things that I was curious about, and maybe at this point I kind of already know the answer, but I still think that it's worth looking up. And so if we want to take a look at the top state gas tax states, I'll give you a few seconds if you want to think about who number one is. All right, time's up. It's California. California is the highest gas tax in the country, which I'm pretty certain at this point comes as a shock to nobody. But so California is the highest at 62 cents. Pennsylvania is the second highest at 58 cents. Illinois is third at 52 cents. And then Washington is fourth at 49 cents. So if you think about it, if you're in California, right, and you're paying 62 cents, and this is according to Tax Foundation, which I'll link it in the show notes. And so it might be slightly off. I'm not, but it's going to be around in that area. But if you think about it, for every gallon of gas that you put in your car, if you live in California, you pay 62 cents for California state tax, and you pay 18 cents for federal. So you're paying about, 80 cents per gallon in tax. So if you're in California and you see, $3.50 or $4 or whatever that per gallon per gallon price is at this point, just keep in mind about 80 cents of that per gallon is taxes. Now, they say that they use it for roads and that kind of thing. And my guess is it's kind of to the point where they accumulate so much of it that a lot of it gets lost and wasted and everything. Because if you're listening and you do live in California, you can probably think of that pothole that's on your normal commute that you have to avoid, and it's been there for years and no one ever seems to be able to fix it, until Pizza Hut comes along, or Domino's or whoever, and they do it, and then they spray paint their logo on it. But so anyway, so 80 cents per gallon, if you live in California, goes to taxes. Now, on the flip side of it, the lowest gas tax states are Alaska, Missouri, Mississippi, and New Mexico. And those are all between 10 and 20 cents or so per gallon. But the reason I bring this up is because as we continue to shift away, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not as voluntarily, to electric vehicles and vehicles that aren't consuming as much gas, the federal government and governments in general have to find a way to replace that lost revenue. Because as we know, if you've been paying attention to listen to the show, or if you pay attention much to politics in general, spending can't go down, right? We can't decrease the spending. So we have to find ways of being able to compensate to increase revenues. That's the way that the government is thinking about it. And so as they are losing gas tax revenues, they have to come up with alternatives to be able to, fund whatever it is that they want to fund. And so that's why they're looking at this. Now, the issue with this and how it relates to the title of the show is, if you think about an additional tax on the amount of mileage that you drive, who is impacted by that, right? Who can you think about is going to be impacted more so by this mileage tax than anybody else? And if you answer poor people with long commutes are going to be mostly impacted, then ding, 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 you win, right? I mean, you win the prize. People who have to commute further for work, or they drive more, are going to be impacted more. And a lot of times, the people who cannot afford to live in close proximity to their jobs typically tend to be people who can't, who can't afford to live there, and so they have to commute further. And so essentially what this tax is it's a tax on the lower working class, the poor class, and middle class people who can't afford to live in the close proximity to work, or they are fortunate, or they're not fortunate enough to be like me, and a lot of other people in my position who are big proponents for things like this, who we now, or at least I call, I picked it up from somewhere, but we're referred to as Zoomers, right? A lot of us have been working from home, or will continue to work from home, indefinitely. And so our commute at this point is basically zero. And so there's a lot of people who are proponents for this and say, all right, well, maybe a mileage tax isn't so bad. And it's because they don't care, or at least they don't think about who is actually going to be impacted. And so what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the fact that not only is it the mileage tax, but it's the majority of taxes that people feel like the government should institute that has a negative impact on the poor. Now, the easiest solution to this, and it's something that we talk about regularly on this show, is if this type of a tax is a concern for you, you have to make more money. As we say on this show, you have a moral obligation to yourself, to your family, and to your community to make as much money as you possibly can. As much as you can, right? Because when you think about it from our standpoint and from your standpoint, you want your kids to have all the advantages in life. You want to be able to build up your community around you and help your friends and help your family and help your neighbors. And to do that, you need to be financially successful. You need to be financially free. And so if you don't want to be concerned about a mileage tax or an excise tax, or, which is alcohol tax and cigarette tax and sin taxes, you need to make more money. And so the underlying message of to the people that are listening is, you need to be financially stable and financially secure and have a strong enough financial freedom to where you can be opposed to a mileage tax, and you should because you know who it's going to impact, but you do not want to allow that to impact your life. And we'll get into some details on it. So, financially speaking, again, because that's what we talk about here, and that's the way my mind tends to work, I think vehicle mileage tax, this has to exist somewhere, right? Someone has to have a mileage tax somewhere, and they do. You know, so the good news is that we have a point of reference that we can use. Two of them in particular are Illinois and Oregon. So Oregon is doing a test program with about 5,000 drivers where they are charging them per mile, a tax. I believe it's around 2 cents. I think it's the same thing for Illinois, give or take a little bit. But what they're also doing is they're also refunding people's gas tax, right? So if you're part of the person who's in this test program, you'll drive, they'll charge you taxes based off of how many miles you drive, you fill up, you submit that, and then you get reimbursed the taxes from that, which is fine for them. But again, like we talked about earlier in the show, the government will not reduce spending, and so they need more money. And as a result, if it turns out that their mileage tax is actually a net negative from their gas tax, the gas tax isn't going to go away, So if they ever did decide to institute this mileage tax, you're not going to get more back from the gas unless maybe you're a Zoomer or whatever the other situations might be. You're not going to get more back because they are not going to have less revenue. That's not the way that this is going to work. It will be more. If another good example, if you work in sales and you work on commissions, a great example of this is that anytime an incentive structure is restructured, right? I know whenever I used to work in sales, a couple of times they came out and they said, well, we're restructuring the incentive plan and we're going to change this to this and we're going to change this to that. The reason is because they can save money. They will restructure it and they will say, well, this is going to be great for everybody because blah, 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 blah. But what's really going to happen is they are going to have an improved bottom line because they will be paying you less. And so the government is a good way to look at it like that, right? They are not going to make less. They will make more. They will just change the wording and that kind of thing to make you think, hey, some people are going to be saving money. So these guys are charging about 2 cents per mile. And so I did the math on it. And if you commute approximately, or if you drive approximately 5,000 miles in a year, it's about $100. Now, again, people are probably thinking, well, $100 isn't that much money. But again, they aren't going to make less money. So that $100 will be on top of whatever else it is that you might already be paying. Now, again, like we talk about, you need to be in the position where that $100 is irrelevant. You should still oppose it, but that $100 would be irrelevant for you in your personal life. One thing that this also does is it disproportionately impacts rural cities, and then it also negatively impacts poor city people who have to travel more for their jobs, which I think is kind of a duh statement. If you happen to live out in the country and you have to drive a lot because the grocery store is 20 miles away or whatever it might be, you're going to drive more. If you're living in a poor urban environment and there happens to not be any jobs that are in close proximity, you're going to have a longer commute. Or, using California again as an example, if you work in the Bay Area, there's a very good chance that you can't afford to live in the Bay Area. So you might be having to commute 30, 40, 50 miles into the city, in which case then you will also be taxed on that commute. So what I found an article from The Atlantic that talks about commutes, right? And the title of the article was "Long Commutes Are Awful, Especially for the Poor." And I'll link it in the show notes, but there was one piece in here that I thought was that kind of summarizes this up pretty well. Between 2000 and 2012, the number of jobs within a worker's commuting distance from 5 miles to 13 miles declined by 7%. For the poor and minorities, though, who often live in segregated, concentrated neighborhoods, the figure was much bigger. Now, I don't want to go into kind of the, they kind of sensationalize there as far as segregated neighborhoods and that kind of thing. I don't want to go that route. But what I think it's important is when we're talking about the poorer neighborhoods, inner city neighborhoods where there's not necessarily the jobs that are close by. So it says for those at the bottom of the income distribution, the decline in local job opportunities decreased by more than double. Proximate jobs for Hispanic metro area residents has declined by 17%. For Black residents, the decline was around 14%. That means longer, more expensive treks to works for those who need work most. So again, this tax, which is going to potentially help fund a $3 trillion infrastructure bill, which, keep in mind, this infrastructure bill is, I'm almost certain, going to be more of a jobs program. So think long-term government contracts for well-connected construction companies, whoever who is going to be able to go out and bid on these essentially blank check infrastructure plans. So think about a bridge or something like that that's relatively close to where you live that's in very poor shape. Now, you might not know how much that's going to cost to fix, but think about what would happen if the contractor, who potentially could get it on a no bid contract, that's not always true, but think about where people are like, all right, well, we know that there is $3 trillion, which is an unbelievable amount of money. None of us can actually fathom what $3 trillion looks like, but they're going to the government and they're saying, well, we can fix that bridge right there, and it's going to cost us $100 million to fix that bridge. Well, the government is going to go, well, this guy over here says he could do it for 95. So we're going to give it to this guy over here for 95. And the guy who got the bid for 95 million goes, this is great. I now have money to fix this bridge when I could probably do it for a fraction of that. But now we have, long-term revenue for our company. So when we go to do our forecasts and our budgets, we can now count on for the next 2 or 3 years, or however long it might be, this steady revenue coming from the federal government to repair this bridge. So all the people who are really going to make out are the people up near the top, right? Because these are the people that are going to be like, well, we can fix this bridge over here for 30 million, but we got a government contract. So now it's worth 95 million, and we can take a little longer, and there might be incentives if they hit a certain deadline, in which then they could potentially get paid more. So think about it. So think about it like that. So those are the people that are really going to take advantage of this situation. Now, the other thing where my head goes, and we kind of alluded to it a little bit at the beginning of the show, is what other taxes exist that are similar to this that a lot of people don't think about, that disproportionately impact the poor and the working class. And the reason for that is because people tend to think that instituting more taxes on certain things help out a certain group, and it tends to be whatever group the government says that it's going to help out, right? But very rarely does it ever actually work out that way. So the next one that I was going to talk about is like a sugar tax, right? So what, and some of you might be aware of a sugar tax, and some of you may not be. But essentially, what the orchestrators and the architects of these taxes are basically saying, if we tax sugar products, then we will get additional revenue from the tax. But we also want to incentivize people to use them less, which makes absolutely perfect sense when you think about it, right? We want to increase our revenues, but we want people to use it less, and so let's increase the cost of it, which makes perfect sense because then everybody wins, right? Well, that's wrong. I mean, we already know that that's wrong, and we don't have to go into that a little bit more. But speaking specifically about a sugar tax, there's an organization in the UK. It's the UK Institute of Economic Affairs, which is the IEA, and their head of lifestyle economics, Christopher Snowden, brought up a really good point that I found was very interesting, and that he talks about how soda and fatty foods have an inelastic demand. Now, what inelastic demand means is that you could potentially change or update the price or whatever it might be, but the demand for those types of products is not going to change. And what that is saying is that if you increase the cost of soda by 15% or 20%, people are not going to consume less sugar, and consume less calories and saturated fats and that kind of thing. What they might do is they might shift to consume a different product. Or what they might actually do is they might just say, well, whatever, my kid likes soda, so I'm going to keep buying it. And now these people are having to pay more out of pocket. For example, a sugar tax passed in Seattle. And another problem too that's a big drawback of these is exemptions, right? So again, Seattle passes a sugar tax, and guess who's headquartered in Seattle? And they happen to get an exception from the rule, because why wouldn't they get an exception from the rule? But old Papa Starbucks or Mama Starbucks or, non-gender identified Starbucks, I don't know, whatever you want to call them. But Starbucks gets an exception, because why wouldn't they get an exception? They get buddies in City Hall. So sugary drinks that are actually made on location, so think a Starbucks store, wouldn't be taxed, because why wouldn't we tax whatever Joe's coffee shop or whatever, but we want to let Starbucks have a bit of an exception. So what that's saying is that sugar demand and the way people consume it would not change based off of the tax implications. But what it will do is it will have a negative impact on the communities that tend to consume those. And so I don't think it's much of a surprise, but your poor and your local or your working class communities do tend to spend more money on those types of beverages than their more affluent counterparts. I found a great piece from the American Consumer Institute that actually looked at data from Mexico and from Philadelphia, and also some from Denmark to break this down a little bit more. So in Mexico in 2014, they instituted a sugar tax, and it only reduced the daily diets by about 7 calories. And 62% of the taxes that were accumulated from this sugar tax was from the bottom income portion of Mexico. They spent approximately 19% of their income on sugary drinks, which was 39 times that of their wealthier Mexican counterparts. Now, keep in mind, this is not saying that they spent 39 times more money on those sugary, items or sugary drinks. What it's saying is that as a portion of their income, they spent 39 times more on these beverages than their wealthy counterparts. And so to give you a little bit of an idea, a 2-cent sugar tax in the US would add approximately about $100 total on a typical yearly bill. Again, most people are going to say, I wouldn't notice that. But poor people, they would notice those types of things more. Again, too, using the Mexico situation as an example, most of those wealthy Mexicans probably weren't drinking a lot of those anyway, similar to here in the US. But on the flip side of it, their poorer counterparts were. In Philly, they passed a sugar tax. And as a result, what ended up happening was, and this is something that I had read, more people were purchasing them, but they were doing it kind of outside of Philly. So think suburbs, that kind of thing. But the sugar tax cost approximately 1,100 jobs, about $80 million in economic impact, and about $55 million in income. So when you think about that, right, think about the people who work at the Coca-Cola distribution centers, they work at local stores, whatever. Most of those are going to be kind of independently run. Some of your smaller ones, not necessarily your chains, right, that have massive inventory where, the bulk of their income is not related necessarily directly to sugary beverages. But in Mexico, it also drove about 30,000 small grocers out of business, and then it also cost about 50,000 jobs. So this is a sugar tax, right? And the overall messaging behind it is, well, we want people to consume less sugar. But no one considers the additional implications in there, because most of the time the people that support these don't care. They don't drink these beverages. They don't think, all they can think about is increased tax revenue. So they don't think about how it impacts the poor, which most of these taxes do. Another example was in Denmark. And so, a similar in Denmark, they had passed a tax on saturated fats, and again, the poor people that live there, or the poorer people, ended up taking the brunt of that. They ended up removing the policy, but what they also found too was that people were actually driving because if you think about Europe, it's pretty compact. They were driving out of the country, buying up whatever they wanted and then driving back in. So not only was, the government not getting the revenue that they thought that they were going to get, but people were just buying the exact same crap. They were just buying it from somewhere else. And so hence why, that they repealed it. But we talked about, the mileage tax. We talk about the sugar tax. But all of these taxes that people don't normally think about tend to disproportionately impact the poor, middle class, the working class, that group, because they are unable to take those types of adjustments as easily as somebody who is in the wealthier group. And they also tend to partake in these things differently, right? Again, sugar consumption is higher for their obesity rates are higher for that group, and so when you do things like this, it tends to impact and negatively impact them more. Another big one is cigarettes, right? Think about cigarette tax. For the people that are listening from New York, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. An average pack of cigarettes in New York is over $10, which is crazy. Now, again, most of us listening to this show probably don't smoke, and we're thinking, well, who cares? Who cares how much a pack of cigarettes are? People shouldn't be smoking. Well, that's a good point, but is that your decision to make? What ends up happening is a lot of times the people who are poor who smoke more. So to give you an idea, the average smoker in the US has less than a college degree and makes less than $50,000 a year. So these are the people who, when you pass a cigarette excise tax and that kind of thing, they are the ones that are charging more. They are addicted to the substance or whatever it might be. And what we're doing is we're basically saying, well, you shouldn't smoke cigarettes, so we're going to keep charging you more and more until you can't afford to pay for them anymore. And then that's how we're going to get you to quit smoking. Well, guess what? That doesn't work. They're going to find other ways. And one of the examples in New York where they have a $5 tax on a pack of cigarettes, people go over to the reservations or they go to other states, they buy tons and tons of cheap cigarettes, then they come back to New York and they sell them. They call them, they have a term for it in New York City. It's called Lucy's. Eric Brown years ago, and unfortunately lost his life, and part of it was enforcement of selling Lucy cigarettes. People aren't going to stop smoking. That's just not going to happen. But what we are going to do is we're going to basically charge them out the ass, so they have to pay more for them, in the tune of $5 a pack in New York. Massachusetts is $4. Hawaii is $3.50. As you can probably imagine, some of the areas like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, some of your tobacco states are a lot cheaper. But again, the poor, in the working class, these are the guys who are going to end up paying these taxes. And there are other ones too that are super interesting. So for example, liquor tax. Liquor is taxed at about 3 times as much as wine. It's taxed about as double as much on beer. And a study that came from the UK, from the BMJ organization in the UK, showed that wealthier people drink less, but they slightly more frequently. And then poorer people drink more heavily and cause greater health problems. I don't think I need to talk to you guys, and maybe it's worth investigating a little bit more as far as the demographics of people who tend to drink wine on a regular basis versus people who tend to drink spirits. I don't think I recall the last time I saw a winery in, downtown Nashville. It's just, or downtown New York City or whatever, right? A lot of times the people that are in those situations don't necessarily have access to that type of thing, or the ability to pay for it. If a bottle of wine is 10 or 12 bucks, or you can get a bottle of cheap whatever for 15 or 20 bucks, it kind of makes sense if they both kind of, quote unquote, get the job done. Another thing too is things like hotel taxes, right? Oklahoma passed a hotel tax. It was like $5 per room, so that was to help pay for teacher salaries, right? And so they're charging an additional $5 per room night. Well, if you're staying at the Ritz Carlton where you're paying $400 a night to stay, an additional $5 isn't going to make that big of a difference. But if you're trying to visit family, you're trying to do something like that, and you're on a budget and your room is $40 a night and you get an additional $5 charged on, I mean, that's what? 12-ish% additional tax on the room that you're trying to stay in. So again, disproportionately going to impact the lower middle class. Another example is like casino taxes. If you go to the casinos in Oklahoma, which this is years ago now, so maybe they don't do this anymore. But if you go to play blackjack, you had to pay 50 cents ante per hand. That's 50 cents. That is not a bet, right? If you win, you don't get your 50 cents back. What you get to do is you get to pay 50 cents per hand that they take. That's the fee, right? Your fee, your tax is 50 cents per hand of blackjack. Now, if you're a person who's sitting there and you're playing $2 to $5 hand blackjacks with your, a couple $100 that you made on the side or whatever it might be, you're already in the hole, right? Because the casino is going to win. The casino has an advantage, but you're also paying in the hole to the government, the local officials who are getting that 50 cents. If you're somebody that's sitting there and you're playing $500 a hand, then who cares about 50 cents? It doesn't even matter. The world that you're playing in is not consistent. And so what I wanted to do on this show is really go over a lot of these taxes and these rules and regulations and things that people tend to think about. And I didn't have time to go into payroll taxes, but maybe I'll do that a different time. But all of these things that people talk about as an option of being able to raise money will continue to disproportionately impact the poor. That's just the way it goes. That's just the way it's going to happen. So next time that you see or hear or read somebody in government talking about increasing taxes on whatever, immediately think of how is this going to impact poor people? Because guess what? It's going to. That's the way it's going to happen. More poor people and more middle class people are going to be hurt by it than is really going to be helped in the long run. So I hope I made that conversation about taxes valuable. I hope you guys learned something. Again, if you did find it valuable, share it with a friend, share it on social media, follow us on social media. All of the above is also wonderful. Subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on where you listen to your podcasts, and we'll talk to you again next week. All right, bye.